Hi, this is Alex Schwartz, VE7DXW from Lynn Valley. We got exciting news. We have discovered what creates radio propagation around the world, and it's very exciting. It has to do with a lot of interesting effects of a whole bunch of different things that we never thought would create propagation. So stay tuned and let's follow the show. So, what is a radio frequency RF seismograph? Well, it's a very big antenna, a very precisely tuned balloon, and a whole bunch of radio systems and computers. So what we have is the radio seismograph. It's a receive-only unit that receives worldwide traffic from digital bands, 80 meters, 40 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters, 15 meters, and 10 meters. And since we're located in a very unique location, we have all this propagation, and it's showing some interesting correlations. So the most the change the most important part is to detect the weak signals. We need a large antenna. There's the 18 HDJR, which is 36 feet tall, and it's super sensitive. It's omnidirectional. The other thing that's important is the balloon. The balloon grounds the antenna, so you get a grounded antenna. So you have static discharges on the antenna. They flow right to the ground, and they don't show up in the RF seismograph. When we put in that balloon, we had a noise to signal decrease of minus 12 dB, which is an amazing additional window that you couldn't see before. We have a lightning protection because yeah, we gotta run it 24/7, and it's remote, so it needs to be safe. It's grounded via a 4-inch copper pipe that runs along the building, and it's grounded at the other side. And we're by sheer luck located on top of a fault line, which makes a huge difference on propagation, as we find out. Now here is the our seismograph operational details. The receiver is a TS590. The LF 2016 is required to convert the IF of the radio so they can be decoded by our seismograph audio card. We work on our Raspberry 3 or 4. Raspberry 4 requires a fan. We have instructions on how to load the software onto your Pi and how this whole thing sets up. The other thing is most important is an analog power supply that's very quiet, and a battery backup, because power is not always as consistent as you would like. So it's good to have a backup battery so the thing doesn't crash. The whole thing is controlled via a remote desktop application that that works on Mac, that works on PC, that works on Linux, and all the other machines. They have application that will run the remote desktop. It's a really universal remote way to control your remote station. The most important part is to use a Cat5, not to use the Wi-Fi, because if you want to remote desktop, the fast network definitely helps your setup. The Cat control is done via USB and FL rig. So once that's all set up, the FL rig changes the frequencies of the radio, and our seismograph, the audio card, listening to the changes in the bands. So this is the unit, what it looks like inside. So we have a fan that is required for the 4, and the gray box on top is the diecast building, a diecast enclosure that will keep the mixer as quiet as possible and keeps the noise out. And there's a there's a choke that eliminates any leftover RF before it goes into the audio card. Keep the signal as clean as possible. The monitor, we monitor 6 different frequencies. So as the frequency band changes, the audio output of the sound card changes, and it's detected by the RF seismograph and recorded. So we correlate the USGS earthquake data by using the RF viewer, which is a software that can run on your computer, and it's very interesting to see the correlations between earthquakes and propagation. And if you happen to be on top of a fault line, it becomes even more clear. So here's the operating principle of the seismograph. We have a high pressure and a point of connection between the subducting oceanic lithosphere and the continental ionosphere, and vibrates the whole continent. In addition to this vibration, there's also the pull of the moon, and we get into that later. And it's amazing how much energy the moon transfers over to the planet. And this whole process is kept electric by piezoelectric activity in the crust, and there's a lot of it. The vibration of earthquakes, the vibration of anything that has seismic activity will make a difference in the in the electromagnetic fields that come out of the ground and hence change the ionosphere. So the ionosphere is a really good way to monitor anything that happened on the planet. So here we have the Mount St. Helens before it exploded, a beautiful mountain. And when the pressure builds up, it blows this top, and you can see the result at the bottom. Now, but and we just had this happen again at Tonga Tonga a couple of months back, and the force of nature is just unyielding. You just don't understand how much power it takes to blow a top of a mountain. But what all these events have in common are the way the seismic activity is dampened via the fault lines. So the fault lines provide a way for the mechanical energy to be dampened by changing it over to electromagnetic fields, and then it can radiate out into space, and then providing a dampening effect that keeps the planet from falling apart. So how do local small quakes create Earth propagation? So the M2.0 2.0 to M2.4 quakes very big, big, very specific about creating propagation, and it's the small quakes that create the short openings, and it's the big ones that create the blackouts, but the small ones is actually the ones that we want to be looking at because they create the propagation that the shortwave radio operators looking for. And the small quakes, they're kind of like a flashlight. They have a flickering field that can create little shock waves that go along the ionosphere, the D layer especially, and it creates gaps into the D layer, so you get less attenuation. And as you go further up, the signal goes up and then comes back down, reflected by the E layer. And if you have small quakes in short progression, the propagation window is kept open. If you have a whole set of quakes distributed over the whole planet, you get ruled by opening. And the opening is determined. The opening frequency is determined by the solar flux. So the higher solar flux, the earthquakes trigger higher frequencies opening. But interesting that even the small quakes create a precursor on the RF seismograph, and that can be detected. So if you have an M7.5 quake, that actually creates a tsunami, electromagnetic tsunami around the planet. And this all has to do with the fault lines that that are used to dissipate all this energy. So if you think about it, if you have such a strong quake, the energy that is released is 11,000 terajoules. 11,000 terajoules. And that's just the radiation energy that blacks out the ionosphere. Then we have an additional 200, 219 exajoules. That's 10 power of 20 of seismic moment energy that rattles the planet. Is moving and is moving all along the fault line. So as the fault lines vibrate, they create electromagnetic fields, and these electromagnetic fields change the propagation near and around fault lines. Such big events can have propagation changes for hours or days, and usually the noise level increases and fissures radiate with electric fields. So in essence, you can say you get an electrical tsunami. The release of the energy into space keeps the planet from breaking apart and dampening the force of the quake, and at the same time lifting the ionosphere. A view from space of how earthquakes change propagation. So this is to show that we always have earthquakes. The earth never stops shaking. So this energy uh, is used to oppose the solar wind and hold up the ionosphere. So what happened at nighttime when you take away the pressure from the solar wind, the magnetic fields can have moved the ionosphere further out. So you get nighttime propagation. When you have an M5.9 quake, as we show here, you get rifts and gaps into the ionosphere. So that means you get additional solar wind coming in, and that can create aurora. And this is a very simple way of looking at that. Earthquakes are constantly on. That is the very important thing, and we really have to think about how much earthquake activity there really is. Here is an earlier picture on showing how the operational principle of the RF seismograph. Very simple. The earthquakes thin the ionosphere, and the signals get distracted. So if you in the lower part where you still had the old ionosphere, the thick ionosphere, signals get refracted, and you have radio communication. Most important is the circulating ground current that creates the field lines during the earthquake. Here we talk about the behavior of the ionosphere. So our seismograph measures the behavior of the ionosphere after an earthquake, because the earthquake changed the ionosphere. And this is only logical because everything is contained in this ionosphere. And if there's any change large enough, it will show up in the ionosphere. And it's amazing how little change it takes to show up in measuring the ionosphere refraction of the ionosphere over long term. That's just as the our seismo does. And of course, from a physics point of view, the UV is converted into different radiations, and also creates ozone, which also reduces the amount of UV that can pass through the ionosphere. So here we have a very old picture of the distribution of the telluric currents, and it's 1936, and I think this was one of the last years where they've done it, and then it disappeared. But it didn't go away; it's still there. So the most important part of that I took out that is that the crustal electric fields are independent from the main electromagnetic field generated by the core. They're created by the moon. The ground flow of electricity surface can be visualized as clouds of rain. Since electrons have mass, they're subject to the moon. And that becomes the second part of where we start to understand of how big a part the moon takes to create these ionospheric disturbances and propagation in general. So in order to understand how much Earth is scratched by the moon and how much that creates electromagnetic fields is important, and we show that in the next slide. The shock front that created by the moon as it moves across the planet also creates a long amount of electricity via electromagnetic fields. And we haven't even uh, started to understand all that. And all this is created by the piezoelectric effect of rocks. And as we start to understand how much energy the moon is transferring to Earth, it's mind-boggling. The amount dwarfs any human impact on the planet. So here we got the moon, and we talk a little bit more about its energy. The moon has a strong effect, influencing earthquakes and volcanic activity. It is in essence supercharging the planet through its tidal cycle. So the total estimate of power generated is twice a day. So there's a power created by the movement of the water. That's easier to calculate. We have uh, we have 6.2 million kilometers of coastline, and every coastline generates about 21 gigawatts of power. So that is 13,000 terawatts of power. So we see the energy is amazing how much power that creates. But it gets even more interesting. So now we're looking at the warping of the continents, which amounts to a lift of the plates by the moon. So it's estimated that the plates move between 11 to 35 centimeters on an average of 25 centimeters when the moon is above. So now we can calculate how heavy that continent is by knowing its average depth, by knowing how dense it is, and what the area is. The area of 150 times 10 to the power of 6 square kilometers is the area. And now, as we calculate the total weight, it's 1.610 times the power 10 to the power of 19 kilograms. So, and now we're going to calculate this, how much energy is required to move that mass 25 centimeters. And it's mind-boggling. It's 4 times 10 to the power of 19 joules of energy required to lift the moon. Anything, so this happens twice a day. This is anything way beyond of what human activity ever has done to this planet. So here we're talking about the location of the aeroseismograph. We have a map of the area here. In the center is the aeroseismograph, and you can see that where the fault lines are. The red fault lines are the hidden ones they have been disturbed by building activity, and we just built over it and had no thought about how that affects the people that live on top. But in a way, it was actually a blessing in disguise, because otherwise I would have never discovered how important fault lines are to radio propagation. And it's very specific. If your antenna is not on top of the fault line, it doesn't work. Fault lines in the mountainous areas break the rock, and so you provide a system of where you can vibrate. And as the seismic activity comes through, it vibrates and it creates those electromagnetic fields that are so important to our propagation. At the same time, this is also what USGS uh, records when they have quakes that are very close to the top. You have that small scientific, small geo, geomed movement that provides just enough energy to move the ionosphere enough so they can get propagation. Here is another closer fault that is official fault that is in the books, and I hiked it up and we took pictures and we took the an EMF meter, and that very closely showed me where the fault lines are. In general, the deeper and longer the cracks are, the more the rock can vibrate, so the more intense the radiation is. Since it creates electricity and magnetic fields only when the rock is dry, through piezoelectricity, it is more visible in the summer. The vibrations are very slow vibrations and are caused by the moon as well as by earthquakes. Here is another fault line found in vicinity of north of Vancouver, and this one shows a very distinct line between the two rifts that moving apart. And again, with an EMF 390 meter, you can detect the radiation that comes out of it. And I would recommend that you find a place like this for your next outing and see how much different the propagation is than what you think on a regular basis. Fault lines are easy to see. They stick out of the surrounding areas. It's either disturbed, strange landscaping, or it's a rift in the ground. So there, in this picture, you can see a rift. So they're always there, everywhere. But you have to, it's like fishing. You have to find the right one that works. Here's a quick picture of the references. So all the stuff that we talked about is backed up by official data. And here's our last slide. So if you wanna look us up, www.rfseismograph.org, or you can join the group. And if you want to email me in person, you can email there. Many thanks to Hassan VE7DXW, and as well Joe Chankas NJ7OK. And here just the last picture, the earthquake response, and it's terrible. So we have to wake up and see the change of how we can monitor this better and how we can better predict earthquakes, because this doesn't have to happen.